Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Lucia, and I'm going to be introducing our speaker for today. So I had the privilege of meeting Shasti last summer during the 2017 Oxfam Change Leader training in Boston. So the Oxfam Change Initiative is a program that brings together college students from around the country to learn about Oxfam campaigns and strategies of fundraising and advocating for various social justice issues. So Shasti was a change leader in 2007 and came back for the 2017 training to share some of her wisdom with us on starting an Oxfam club at her college campus and later pursuing a career in social justice advocacy. I was immediately drawn to her story and made a point to maintain contact soon after because of how strongly I admired all that she had accomplished at such a young age. So upon graduating from Seattle University in 2008, Shasti went to work as a field organizer on the Obama presidential campaign. Immediately afterwards, she went to work as an assistant to Senior Advisor Valerie Jarrett at the White House, where she managed key stakeholders such as the Special Assistant to the President for Disability Policy and the Briefings Manager for the President, First Lady, and Vice President. In 2015, Shasti received her Master's in Public Affairs and International Development at Princeton. While at Princeton, Shasti was a senior graduate fellow at the Malala Fund, where she traveled to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony with Malala and her family. Shasti provided programmatic support and logistical management for the Malala Fund. Furthermore, she was the co-chair of the Students and Alumni of Color Network at Princeton, where she did key work with the dean of the university to make both the admissions recruitment process and curriculum of the master's program more diverse and inclusive. In 2015, Shasti was the chief operating officer for Sozi Productions, a creative social impact agency focused on social justice campaigns. Then she went to work on the national advance team for the Senator Bernie Sanders 2016 presidential campaign. She also ran for elected office, finishing third out of 8 candidates for Washington State Senate's 37th legislative district. Currently, Shasti is the U.S. campaign manager and regional planning advisor for the 100 Million campaign, which aims to be the largest youth mobilization in history to end child labor and trafficking. This campaign was launched and is headed by Kailash Satyarthi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014 alongside Malala. Please join me in welcoming an incredible activist, a pioneer in bringing diversity to institutional positions, and a key advocate for social justice issues across U.S. politics.
So my name is Annalise Orlick. I teach history in women's and gender studies, sexuality studies here. And we're going to try to make this a conversation. So I have a few questions for Shasti, but we were thinking it might be nice if you guys just jump in wherever you would like. If there are questions, if there are things that you'd like clarified more, just raise your hand. There's a mic. We ask because this is being filmed that you speak into the mic, but other than that, it would be really nice to make this as much of a collective endeavor as possible. So, Shasti, I guess I wanted to frame this by saying you've worked with 3 very different kinds of Nobel laureates, and I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the constraints and possibilities that each offered for change, and maybe throw Bernie Sanders in there too, and say another change agent, right, and a different strategy for promoting change through electoral politics. So, yeah, let's start with that frame and see where we go.
Yeah, I mean, as I was looking back, I was realizing that there was this sort of common thread throughout my career, which was getting to work with these major change agents who had developed a platform for their particular causes. And as I sort of look back onto their different characteristics, their personalities, the way that they do their work, I think the most common thread is that they all have a really strong sense of self. They have spent the time to really get to know who they are, what makes them special, and what's their purpose, what's their calling. They've all taken that time to really figure that out. And for some of those people, it happened over time. I think both for President Obama and for Kailash, they came to those causes and to that purpose through self-reflection, through working in different projects in different areas. And Malala, I think it was very much thrust in that she happened to be on her school bus in Pakistan, and all of a sudden she's confronted with a geopolitical crisis, which is the Taliban. The Taliban got onto her school bus and shot her point blank, and all of a sudden she is thrust into the limelight and suddenly sort of becomes this beacon and has this platform. So I think, there's different ways that all three of them came into their positions to be able to have that platform, but all of them have recognized the value in being able to use their stories, their voices, to talk about a larger cause, to do the work, and all of them have been able to have strong personalities, but that have led to a social movement that is so much bigger than just each one of them. And they've used that sort of people power to then affect institutional changes. They've all tackled institutions, whether, for President Obama, obviously domestically in the United States, but both Kailash and Malala, have lobbied the UN, have worked with the Kailash, led the global march, which resulted in the Ilo Convention 182, which was against child labor. And Malala, has become this sort of global force for girls' education. So all of them have figured out how to do that positioning to be able to both inspire folks on the ground to create this kind of tidal wave of action, but also channeled that into real policy change and institutional change.
So it would seem on the surface of it that working for the President of the United States would enable you to have the greatest impact, but there are constraints, obviously, to working in a situation like the White House and in a city like Washington, D.C. So I wondered if you would speak both about, first of all, about how you ended up so young in that position in the White House, but then secondly, because I suspect there are some Rocky students who might be interested in that path, but secondly, to talk about then again what you felt like you were able to accomplish in that position and what not. What were your frustrations?
Yeah, I mean, I joined. Well, I was a senior in college when a young Barack Obama announced that he was running for president. And I actually was working on a project for my sociology thesis related to sort of political participation and how to get young people, and particularly young people of color, involved in the political process. And he declared in the middle of that research, it was like literally that year that he came forward, and it radically changed my research, and it radically changed the country. And what it was that he was different. He represented this segment of the population that had so rarely seen themselves reflected, both sort of in mainstream media and on this platform, and just also at the table, also in decision-making processes. They hadn't seen someone like that, and I was really drawn to him because I had read his book, The Audacity of Hope. And I'm adopted from India. I was raised by a single Caucasian mother in Oregon, a small town in Oregon. And so when I read The Audacity of Hope, I immediately felt this connection to him. I felt like someone understood that feeling of not fitting in all the time, sort of also dealing with that within your own family, trying to understand who you are in this larger picture, how that could make an impact. And it really spoke to me, and I just wanted to be a part of it. I just wanted to help him. And I always like to remind folks, like, we weren't supposed to win. We weren't the bet. We were running against a very strong candidate, Hillary Clinton, and she was most likely going to be the nominee. And so I just did it because I believed in him. And then we won, and that meant that I had the opportunity to get to go to the White House. And a friend of mine had been working on the campaign and went to go set up the internship program, and she called me and she said, I think you should try for this. And I think over 6,000 people applied, and 100 interns were chosen. And I was the first class of summer interns in the Obama administration, and I worked in the Office of Urban Affairs. And, I had grown up on the West Coast. I had grown up in Oregon in a town of 15,000 people. I went to Seattle University, which is a Jesuit school, but also about 4,000 undergrad. So not huge, and hadn't spent much time on the East Coast. So it was my first experience of really seeing what it was like to be in the, hallways of power, right? And these people who come from backgrounds like Dartmouth and Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and I saw that there were opportunities that they had previously that I had not, and so getting to be in the White House was both sort of personally fascinating and a very steep learning curve, but a very quick sort of fast-paced thrown into the fire and sort of see what comes out of it. And there was so much energy. I always like to go back to that time because we were so hopeful. We weren't supposed to win. This young man, was beaming and he was charming and he, campaigned on hope. And then we won and we're there. And I mean, there was just so much energy around that. And then we got to the White House and it was difficult. And there were a lot of people who had never worked in government like that. Many of the staffers who had been on the campaign were also in their early 20s, and who were now in senior roles in the White House and were figuring it out. We didn't know where the phones were in the first couple of days, basic things like that. And so the constraints were really, it was a steep learning curve. I think the healthcare debate is proof of that learning curve. I think that the president came in thinking that he had a reasonable proposal, that he had the public mandate that people wanted universal health care, that this was solving a problem. And then he got to Washington, D.C., and he suddenly had to grapple with policymakers who had been entrenched in D.C. politics for decades, who had their own battles, their own supporters, their own lobbyists, and it wasn't as simple as I think he initially thought. And we spent a lot of political capital. One of the great lessons I learned was I saw the first draft of the healthcare bill, and it included the public mandate, it included a public option, and to watch that bill get torn apart and stripped and stripped and stripped to the point where it might be able to pass by just 1 or 2 votes, and how hard that battle was and how much political capital was spent to get to something that not really anybody loved, and how painful that process was, really taught me kind of how DC works. And the idea, what I kept hearing at that time, the refrain was, well, we'll fix it later. Like, we just have to pass something and then we'll add to it later. The problem is that we had spent so much political capital that later never really came. Mm-hmm. And you see now, in the Trump era, it was the first thing they tried to get rid of. It's the first thing they tried to destroy. And so just trying to make that little bit of change, it takes every person pulling all the various levers to be able to try to get one little thing passed. And that was every single day there was something like that we were trying to get done, and that was very difficult.
So did you end up feeling like, I want to stay in the halls of power, or did you feel like you're going to move to a different direction for making change?
So my internship was just over the summer, and I was supposed to go to graduate school because my mentors had all been college professors. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the thought of like a good life would be to go to a university and write and research. Yeah. And so I was enrolled in a PhD program for sociology, and I got to Washington, D.C., and was just in awe of the opportunities. I was in awe of President Obama and his staff, and it just, I was 23 years old, I was a kid. Yeah. And so I just thought, whatever I can do, I want to stay. I just want to try to stay. And so I worked really hard, and finally a job opened up officially in the Office of Public Engagement. So I became the special assistant to the President on Disability Policy, and then was promoted 7 months later to work for Valerie Jarrett, who was the president's best friend and chief advisor. And so then I just worked for about 2.5 years and tried to do what I could to support the work that was happening. I then decided to leave to go on the 2012 campaign because I wanted to make sure that we had another term. And I did that and spent a year in Chicago doing that. And by that point, at the end of the campaign, we won, which was great, but it had been a lot. And I'd been sort of in the trenches for about 5 years at that point. And I felt like I needed to sort of go in a different direction. I wanted to have a more global perspective to the work that I was doing. So I decided to go to graduate school. So my form of a break was to go to Princeton and to go to graduate school. But in part because, it was going to be 2 years where I was going to be able to invest in my own brain, and I was going to be able to really have the space and the time to think about policy innovations and solutions. And I realized I kind of did it backwards. I got thrown into an environment where we were doing the work, but I was missing the foundation. And so I decided to go back to graduate school, in part to try to understand what I had just lived through. and so that's what sort of pushed me to then go to graduate school, which was there where I met Malala while I was at graduate school.
Before we move on to Malala, does anyone have any questions about the Obama years?
So I just want to say I was a part of the last Obama internship.
I just want to say I was a part of the last Obama internship class that ended in 2016.
Wow. Which office did you work in?
Office of Presidential Correspondence.
Ah, yes, okay.
Yeah, and it was like the best experience that I ever had. So, and I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to like
Did
thank
you know
you.
Darren Martin?
Yes, yeah, and I met Valerie Jarrett because she came and gave a talk to the whole internship class. But it was really cool. They always like reference back to like the first internship class and like how things have changed over the 8 years. So
We set a tone, you know.
yeah, you definitely set a tone.
Hello, my name is Emmanuel. Thank you for joining us. So I guess with anyone, especially in like something as big as a presidential campaign, you have like your big crop of supporters, but at the same time, you have people who just really do not like you, who do not want you in office. Did you get any sense as to how Obama kind of dealt with that, and even going into office and kind of dealing with members of Congress who were like not his biggest fans at all? Yeah, thank you.
Great question, and yes, it's very common. I mean, what I've seen with all of the Nobel laureates, and in fact, as I've taken on some more public roles, it's often a first sign that you're doing some good work if you get those detractors. If people are wanting to push back because you're trying to push for some change, that means you're onto something. And I think that President Obama really believed in that as well. We used to call him No Drama Obama, and he's very steady. He is somebody who when you're in the middle of a crisis, he's who you want in the room because he's going to be able to listen and take the temperature down and be able to, he can take criticism, he can take the hate, and part of that self-esteem, part of that knowing of yourself is that you know when someone is telling you something that's actually useful information, even if it's critical. If it is actually, you know what, I made a mistake there, I made a bad call, they're calling me out in the right way. But also knowing, actually, that person's just outraged about something else that has nothing to do with me. And being able to filter that out, he was really excellent at that. He employed a leadership style called Team of Rivals, which was modeled after Abraham Lincoln, and Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a book about Team of Rivals, and it had come out around that time, and Obama really employed that, which is he built a cabinet that was made up of people who, some of them had not been his supporters. He had a Republican as his transportation secretary, Hillary Clinton, obviously as Secretary of State. They had at one point been on opposite sides. And he really tried to make sure that his room was always full of people who brought different perspectives. And that was a way for him to sort of curtail the hate, was to be able to listen and recognize when it was useful information and when it was not. And yeah, I mean, there was a lot of pressure. Those early days, there were bomb threats. I read recently that under the Obama administration, there were more break-ins over like people jumping the fence or trying to get into the White House, that Secret Service had to, remove people more than any other administration in any other time. And every day he lived with that pressure. And there were threats against his children and his wife. And to think about, you're having to make these heady, massive decisions that are going to affect millions of people, but you also are knowing that by stepping out there, you also are potentially putting your children and your wife in danger as well. There's a fortitude you have to be able to believe that the work is worth it, that it's going to be okay. And Kailash and Malala both have that as well, is that feeling of the work is more important than us as individuals. And so Kailash even says, we're just people. If I die, my daughter dies, that we're just one or two people, but there's 152 million kids out there that need our help. So the work is worth it. And that's how you deal with the hate.
All right, let's move on to Malala. So very different scenario. As young as Obama was, right? He was in his 40s. He was very much a grown man.
Yeah.
Here you have a 15-year-old girl who is, victimized in this particularly brutal and traumatic way. Tell us a little bit about how you see her stepping onto the world stage and what her vision is, what kind of work you did together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, working for Malala was transformative. I actually learned a great deal from just simply being in her presence. And when I was working with her, I was almost twice her age.
Yeah.
And so, you know, to see such a young woman, young person with that strong, also like Obama, very, very stable, very grounded, and a fearlessness. And one of the big lessons I learned working with Malala was, you know, for all intents and purposes, she should have died. I mean, to have been shot in the head point blank like that, to survive it, I mean, the chances are probably less than 1%. And I think there's something really freeing that happened with the fact that she survived. I think and actually she faced her fear of death, and then has been living on borrowed time. And I think she recognizes that means that every day is a gift, every day is a tool, every day is an opportunity to be able to make some kind of impact. And that's all she has. You know, she just has her voice, she has herself, and she brought that into the work every single day. And, you know, I think sort of for her, I mean, the family was living in Swat Valley, Pakistan, which is like, you know, middle of nowhere. And, you know, almost like the Oklahoma of Pakistan, you know, and, you know, they were thrust into this global spotlight. And what they did was to then turn that into all of the attention. It was like, great, we have a spotlight, so let's shine it on all these other girls who should be allowed to go to school. And, you know, I think, again, it was sort of how do we translate this into real action? And then how can we influence to be able to change these policies?
Now, when you use the phrase borrowed time, it suggests that she feels that her life is still very much in danger. Would you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. I mean, you know, she hadn't been back to Pakistan until just a few months ago. There was a real threat to her life. The Taliban had said that if she tried to come back, that they would kill her. You know, certainly that they would kill her family. And you know, and she still would get threats even when they were living in the UK. They would still hear that there was some sort of, you know, call to try to end her life. And so I think she, you know, the whole family was always sort of in this awareness of it could happen at any moment. And so we're just going to continue to live our lives, and we're going to use our voices to try to shine this light on this issue of girls' education for as long as we can. And we know what is at stake here, but that's just who they are. They almost feel like there's no other choice here. There's no other option. This is what they were meant to do in their lifetime.
You know, it's one thing for a teenager to make that decision. Teenagers are famously imbued with a sense of immortality, but it's a very different thing for a parent of teenager, especially one who's been so brutally assaulted, to make that decision. So I wonder if you would talk about her father. And,
Yes.
He's famously part of the story, but we haven't talked about him.
Yes. Her father, Ziauddin, is one of the most incredible men I've ever met, and they very much were a pair. The two of them traveled because oftentimes her mother would stay with her brothers in the UK, and so the film that came out a year or so ago was called He Named Me Malala, and because he really saw this option of that it was a gift that he had been given a girl, and that he really saw her as this beacon of hope that was different than how a lot of girls are viewed in the developing world, and particularly in Pakistan. And so yeah, I mean, she very much is her father's daughter. It's very much he was really a passionate advocate for education. He was a sort of the school principal. He was the teacher. And so for her, she grew up in that. She grew up in really valuing education. And so you can see this very deep connection between the two of them, where they support one another and they feel very much as though they are doing this work together.
So one of the things that made her controversial in Pakistan, as you know better than I, was this idea that she became a darling of the West, and she became a proxy for this idea that Muslim societies are so repressive and the men are all brutes. And I wondered, why do you think the story of her father didn't dissipate that myth?
Well, I think that I mean, she really was the focus
Yeah.
for much of it. The spotlight. It was her name. It was her on the cover of the book. You know, it's her face on the movie
And it was
poster.
she who was shot.
She was the one who was shot. I mean, you know, before the term alternative facts, they were definitely operating on this. I mean, there was you know, rumor that it had all been a lie, that she hadn't actually been shot, that she was just this puppet of the West, and that she was being used, and that it was, you know, that this was all propaganda. And the Taliban actually used Malala as a tool to recruit, to say, look at what the West is doing, and we need to not only kill Malala, but kill any girl that is going to be used by the West, that's going to try to go to school. And so, yeah, I mean, it is a really interesting sort of space that she inhabits, because beloved, I mean, wherever we would travel to, people would cry, they would hug her, they would be, you know, she was this beacon of hope. But then, you know, the thought of going home, they were, I mean, literally up until just a few months ago, it was out of the question. And I remember having multiple conversations with her where that's all they would talk about. Her dream was, her role model was Benazir Bhutto, and her dream was to go back to be the Prime Minister of Pakistan someday. And I believe she will. I think she actually will. But that's all they wanted. I remember we were in LA once, and we were in the sort of kind of the hills, and we were looking up the mountains, and her father was just like, it reminds me of SWAT. Like, you know, they so wanted to go back. And for me, growing up in the United States, I through them understood what they had lost. That so often we think about sort of Muslim and, you know, Western relationships in this framework around 9/11. And it's this, you know, oh, the Taliban are so terrible, and the Muslim, you know, there's something, you know, something radical, right, about this faith. And it's not true at all. People like Malala and her family were the first victims of an ideology that had spun out of control. And all they want is to be able to go home. That's all they want. They're not trying to escape some terrible place. They're just under the rule of folks who have really subverted the faith from what its basis is, which is peace.
So we have questions about Malala and the work that she's doing and the work that Shasti's doing with Malala.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the work that you're doing that you did with the fund?
Sure. Yes, so I started working with them in the summer of 2014, and so she was shot in 2012, and then the book had come out in 2013, and so they were just starting to build up the fund as this avenue to be able to channel sort of the fundraising and attention into actually implementing policy changes, and also really building up schools in the developing world for these girls to be able to go to school. So I was employee number 5, and we were just trying to kind of figure out what form this was going to take. So it was programmatic support. We worked on setting up a couple of grants for schools in Kenya, schools in India, schools in Pakistan. And then when I was with her that summer, she went for her birthday, she went to Nigeria, because it was the summer that Boko Haram had kidnapped hundreds of girls. And so she went to Nigeria to speak to the President Goodluck, and say, you know, that they needed to do more. And so we helped put that trip together. We helped to really prep her with the right policy asks, and then just supported on her sort of travel with really trying to get the word out about the need for girls' education. Because one of the things in, you know, the Western world is that most folks don't realize that there are so many girls who aren't able to go to school, and really being able to demonstrate that is a true problem that can be fixed if attention is given to it, if funds are given to it.
Other questions on Malala? I noticed that you said that you didn't mention anything about building schools in Pakistan.
At the time, it was difficult.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, having much interaction in Pakistan was difficult. They sent some money back to support. There was a major flood that happened that summer, and so they sent some money back to a particular school that her father had relationships with the sort of administration there. But the infrastructure was challenging, in part because that she was not popular within her own country.
I have a question. I'm curious if someone like Malala, being young and kind of being suddenly thrust into a public role, I'm sure there's a lot of people who want to kind of use her story for their own agenda. And I'm curious if you were in on conversations of how you kind of pick and choose what events she's going to attend, what awards she's going to accept, and how she got ahead of that wave to shape her own agenda rather than having it shaped for her.
I mean, so much, it's a great question. So much of it is about being able to control your own narrative and being able to get ahead of the storytelling. So that's why in part it was so important for her to be the one to write the book, you know, and to be a part of that process to get her version of the story out there before anyone else started to do their own sort of profiles and subvert that story for their own purposes, as you laid out. And, you know, really making sure that whoever that we were, you know, having her meet with, or that she was going to attend an event, that there was a real grounding in it being about the work and not just about the celebrity. She didn't do things if it seemed like it was just going to be kind of like a glamour, you know, or if it was like, well, let's take a photo of her and then we'll raise money off of it. She had zero interest in that. She always, at 15 and 16 years old, she most wanted to be able to like have policy conversations with world leaders. She didn't want to go to the fancy parties or any of that stuff. They really disliked having to do things like that. They understood that at times that was valuable if it helped to get the story about the cause out. So every time folks wanted to talk to her about, you know, her, she would share her story, but she'd always connect it to there are 68 million girls like me that are also going through this. You know, she would always talk about how, you know, you see Malala, but there could have been Malala at 13 with 2 small children. You know, she would always make sure that she was connecting her as Malala to other people's stories who were like hers. When we went to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony, we took a girls' delegation with us. We took 5 girls who represented the different programs that we were working on. So there was a girl from Nigeria, there was a girl, 2 girls who were on the same school bus with her from Pakistan, there was a girl from India. And so it was really, she, in her speech, talked about those girls. She named those girls as being, it's not just about Malala, it's about Shazia, it's about these other girls. That's what it's about. And so we always made sure that that was the messaging, so that it wasn't just about, you know, kind of her or being used for just sort of frivolous fundraising for other people's causes.
What's next for Malala?
Well, she's in school.
Good.
She's at Oxford.
Yeah.
She's getting
That's
to be
right.
a college student, like so many of you. She's getting to actually, like, you know, study and she has friends. She's on Facebook, so I see her now, where, you know, there's pictures of her just like in the cafeteria, and it makes me so happy that she gets to have that experience. When I was with her, she was 15, 16, 17 years old, and I think that was one of the things that I really recognized, is that she was so often in rooms where it was all adults. You know, it was so often that she didn't get to just be a kid. And, you know, some of my fondest memories were getting to have like dance parties, you know, where we would sort of like, we'd come back from a big, you know, fancy policy talk or something, and then we would just hang out and play Beyonce and get to see her be a teenage girl, and we talk about shoes and things like that.
So how did you move from that to Kailash and the 100 million?
So I was not familiar with Kailash's work before going to the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony with Malala.
Oh, right, he was her co-laureate.
Yeah, they won together, and I think in part because the Nobel Committee saw the beauty in someone from India and somebody from Pakistan working on children's rights at the same time, but, you know, in different ways. And you have this sort of striking image of this 16-year-old girl with this, you know, man from India who's in his 60s, who's been doing this for 40 years. And I remember being in the Oslo City Hall during the ceremony, and they showed a film about Kailash. And they showed Kailash, who kind of looks like an Indian Abraham Lincoln. He's very tall, busting down doors and removing kids from these sweatshops and really, doing the work to really rescue these kids. And as a child from India, as an adopted kid, I saw myself in those kids. I just kept thinking that could have been my life. If one thing had changed, that would have been where I was. But here I am working for Malala in the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. And so I just wanted to be a part of Kailash's work. I just sort of felt this call that I wanted to support him.
Could you give a little background on him?
Sure.
People and
Yes.
his work?
So Kailash Satyarthi is from India. He has dedicated his life to really trying to end child labor and child trafficking. He was called to it. He was a journalist. He wrote for a paper in India and came to the cause because a friend of his had come to him and said, my daughter has been taken, and asked for his help to write a story and asked for his help to kind of investigate what had happened to his daughter. And so Kailash, as a young man, I think he was in his mid-20s, sort of learned about this issue and really just felt called to try to do something about it. And so they just started doing these raids where they just started trying to find, when they would see children who are out begging or who were working, they would try to find them and bring them back home to their families, or eventually they created this rehabilitation center, this ashram, where the children were able to kind of play and go to school and be kids. And so he spent almost 40 years now doing this work. He's rescued almost 87,000 children by doing this work.
Wow. And
it's incredible to just, he's built this incredible sort of, this movement, and about 20 years ago, they launched the Global March Against Child Labor, and that was a global movement that led to the Ilo Convention 182.
explain what that is.
So basically that just, it's like a UN convention that basically says that all countries that sign on to it agree that there won't be any child labor in their countries, and it sets forth different ways that they sort of track that and the way that they fight that. And it's made a big dent. Just less than 10 years ago, it was over 250 million children were in child labor and being trafficked. And now it's 152 million, which is still a huge number. Yeah. But that's a big difference that, that the work has made. And so he was awarded the Nobel at the same time as Malala. And I started working with him formally in January of 2017.
How did you get? You met him at the ceremony.
I met him, and I was looking for some sort of feeling called to do something related to India, because I actually hadn't been back to Calcutta, which is where I was born, and I was sort of feeling this kind of calling to sort of get connected back to my own heritage. And I thought that Kailash might be a good opportunity to be able to connect my own story with this work that was really meaningful. And they were launching the 100 Million campaign, which is a youth empowerment campaign, and they were looking for someone to lead it in the United States. And so it sort of fit well in that it allows me to work on something that is tied to India, but also is in my wheelhouse because of my domestic political experience here in the United States.
Could you talk about the 100 Million campaign?
Yeah, so the 100 Million campaign is a 5-year campaign. It is focused on the 100 million most marginalized children. And the idea is that we're asking for young people, we sort of target youth between the ages of 13 to 25, to really take this cause on as the cause of their lifetime. That the end of our belief is that, in the next 20, 30 years, if we all really take this on, that we could end child labor and child trafficking. And that we all are committed to trying to create a child-friendly world where every child is able to be free, safe, and educated. That's the baseline, that every child should be able to have a childhood. Mm-hmm. And so we are building a campus network and high schools and trying to bring young people into this movement to really take this on. Kailash talks about it in terms of globalizing compassion, and that if young people see themselves alongside those 100 million most marginalized children, that we can do this together, that we can really say that we're not going to allow for children to have anything other than a childhood where they're able to go to school, they're able to be free, and they're able to be safe.
I wondered if that movement has interacted at all with the recent marches and protests in India around the child rapes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. In the fall, actually, Kailash launched the Baharat Yatra, which is a march, and they marched across all of India, really, really trying to get the word out about sort of child sex abuse in particular, because it's something that isn't talked about in India, and there's been a lot of really public stories related to rape and to the trafficking of children, and so really he took this on and you know, and the march was very successful, but also you know, that Prime Minister Modi also took this on as something that he was going to make as a policy platform for his own work in the Indian government.
Interesting. Questions on the 100 million? Kailash? The issues of trafficking? Nothing more? All right, so in our last 15, 20 minutes, maybe move on to talk about your own, well, let's talk about the 2016 campaign, and then maybe Me Too and the Democratic Party now, which all are things you're involved in. So how does Bernie fit into this range of people that you've been working with?
Yeah, Bernie was post-Malala, pre-Kailash. I've obviously been involved in both of the campaigns under President Obama. And, you know, sort of as I was getting towards 2016, I was like, I think I'm tired. I think I'm going to sit this one out. And then, you know, life just kind of opened up in a way, and I thought, okay, well, like, let's just see. And I didn't know much about Bernie Sanders before I started working for him. I had a few friends from the Obama White House that had gone to go work on his campaign. And I went into it slightly skeptical, I'll be honest. You know, there's a little part of me that was like, well, it actually kind of felt like 2008, where I was like, well, you know, the likely nominee is Hillary Clinton. And yeah, always trying. And, you know, he's kind of, I'm drawn to his policies. I think that there's, you know, he was addressing classism and income disparity, which I think is really one of the major issues of our time in the United States. And that sort of called to me. He was talking in a way that was much more radical than, you know, I had sort of been. Socialism was a dirty word. You weren't supposed to say those things. And he was saying it, and saying it sort of proudly. So I just decided, okay, I'll go help this guy and sort of see where that takes me. But again, was like, you know, it's going to be Hillary, but I'll just kind of do this. And then I took on this role where I was crowd advance. So I was on the road with him, and we were traveling and changing cities every 3 days. And I kept witnessing people who knew every word to his speeches, who felt, who were really like, he was speaking directly to them in a way that I hadn't seen since 2008 Obama, really. And the crowds were bigger. I mean, my largest crowd was 35,000 people in Brooklyn. And that was a week after there had been nearly 30,000 in Manhattan. So, you know, and it was like, something's happening here. I mean, it caught me by surprise, but there was clearly he had tapped into a cultural moment that people were really looking for someone to take these issues on. And what I kept seeing was that, I mean, the media would talk about it as it was all just white men that were attracted to Bernie. And what I was seeing with my own eyes was not that at all. It was actually some of the most diverse crowds I had witnessed. It was people from all different backgrounds, different races, who were coming together around these policies. And Bernie was speaking directly to them in a way that I really hadn't seen.
Why do you think that the media representation of his campaign was that, right? The rap was that young people of color in particular were not interested in Bernie, and so why, if that's different than your experience, why do you think it was framed in those ways?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, the media often has a thesis that it then looks to try to prove. And so to seed a good story, it was, I think, easy to sort of say, here's Hillary Clinton, who has, you know, women supporting her, has sort of the, you know, second wave feminists, and then also, you know, younger women and people and also sort of, you know, the Obama folks were rallying behind her. And here's this older white guy who was was supposed to not really be, again, like not supposed to win, not supposed to, who was attracting, supporters and getting energy. It was easier to talk about that and try to see divisions if it was gender-based, I think. I think it was easier to just say, oh, it's just the Bernie bros, and that's why they're not getting on board with Hillary, is because they're deep down, they're sexist. And some of that is true. Some of that is true, and those folks, unfortunately, were oftentimes the loudest voices in the room. But it was deeper than that. It was more complicated than that. It was, there were policy differences that were very key, that when you want to get into policy nuances, the media doesn't like that because it's hard. It's hard to talk about that. It's hard to understand that. And also you have to then talk about things like income disparity. You have to talk about the fact that there is this massive wealth gap. And that doesn't feed a good story. And a lot of the folks who are making news are owned by corporates, right? They're owned by folks who don't want to have those conversations. So it was easier to just dismiss it as this is just a movement for, sort of Bernie bros, than I think it was to really delve more deeply into what was happening there. And, I think there was a real wave of populism, in part because folks really felt like the system had abandoned them. And, for better or for worse, Trump rode that wave as well. And both Bernie and Trump were better able to tap into the cultural rage that people were feeling than I think Secretary Clinton was able to, because she had a woman doing this for 40 years is sort of trained to have to try to make, keep a certain perspective of, we're going to be okay, we're steady, I'm strong, I can be a leader in this way, and you can't show that you're angry as well, or you get cast as being sort of a harpy, or something that isn't about the policy, but more about you as a woman. And I think that was partially what was going on as well.
Questions? Yeah.
Hello, thank you. I have another question. Working with Malala or even Obama or Kailash, do you know if any of them ever felt kind of like, their story, they use their story as a beacon of hope and like empowerment for others, but did you ever notice them kind of almost feeling almost like a burden, like, I'm responsible for leading this movement, I'm responsible for being the voice? Because if you look at like Malala's story, she kind of has a lot of weight on her shoulders, because like, yeah, it's empowering, yeah, it's inspiring, and she's doing a lot of work, but personally, did she ever like open up to you, like, wow, like, I'm so young, how am I gonna do this, and why me, I guess? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's also one of the greatest gifts of getting to be around some of these figures, is that you realize that they're human and that, they get tired, they get hungry, they get annoyed at, like, some news story said something not so nice about them, and that was annoying to them, and it made them have a bad day. And so, yeah, I think, all of them at moments definitely have had that feeling of the weight, and feeling like, do I have it in me to do this tomorrow, to get up and do this tomorrow? And what I've seen all of them do is to feel that, to not shy away from feeling tired, grumpy, feeling the burden, feeling like I don't want to do it, but still doing it. But still then making that choice of the work is worth it. And, President Obama would always say, you have to keep your eye on the prize. He, better than almost anyone I've ever met, was able to see the long game and was able to recognize that, people are fighting, people are yelling about this thing today, but, if you keep your eye on the horizon, you're going to weather that and you're going to actually be able to get more done. And so if you can't always be caught up in the ebbs and flow of life. Sometimes you're going to have a good day, sometimes you're going to have a bad day. And so you just have to sort of make the choice that this is the life that you're going to lead, and you're going to try to put it to use. And I think they all have dealt with that, in varying degrees, but they've all felt that it wasn't a burden, but that it was an opportunity, that there is a gift to it, even though it can be still tiring, it can be frustrating, it can be overwhelming. But if you see it as an opportunity, then it kind of calms some of those maybe not so good feelings down a little bit.
Other questions? Yeah.
I had a sort of a bit general question, which kind of is linked to the overall idea of the Nobel Laureates in affecting changes. So I guess in our three cases, we have the Nobel Peace Prize, which is usually when it's awarded, it's for having an exemplary person who has led large, even transnational, global efforts tackling some large negative forces, to say the least. So, for example, Kailash, from what I understand, has dealt with massive labor exploitation, child sexual exploitation, and Malala Yousafzai has even nearly spent her life towards entrenched misogyny and abuse, and the murderous variations on that. But then when we talk about the Nobel Peace Prize, and then I started thinking about something that isn't really underscored. It's the Obama Nobel Peace Prize record, and the U.S. military machine, which Malala Yousafzai did denounce. And we got back to this idea of what was underscored when she says things, when she doesn't say things. She did denounce drone attacks, imperialist encroachments, and things like that. Do you think that there's something about the idea of the Nobel Peace Prize and advertise nice geopolitical representations that kind of has to be discussed when we talk about large military powers in the world? And thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're talking about the actual sort of awarding of how do you choose who is going to get an award like that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all of these things are fraught, right? They're all, because there's a choice that's made by a particular committee or a particular person or a particular government or and that's always going to have some kind of bias to it. There's going to be a particular perspective of what it means to be bringing peace into the world, while also grappling in a world that is oftentimes not peaceful. And so I think, all of them have faced critics and criticism, not just of I don't like them, but in very deep, real sort of, is Obama a hawk? Is he, Malala, when she met him, said, stop dropping drones on my people. And, there are those constant sort of trade-offs of, making really hard decisions and taking policy positions that are complex, that are not always so black and white. Sometimes I think about, Obama needing to make the decision to send the SEAL team in to kill bin Laden. That is not an easy decision because you're putting people's lives at stake, and you're also calling on someone to be taken out in that way. But the other option is that potentially a bomb can go off and thousands of people are killed. So every day folks are making those types of decisions and trade-offs that are complicated, and it is not easy, I think, until you're in that position to fully understand what that weight is. The young man was talking about the burden. That is a hard decision that you have to then live with. So yeah, I think that the Nobel Committee has been grappling with what it means to award certain people or certain groups, and I think some years they've picked folks that are somewhat universally liked, and then the other years where they haven't, where folks have said, have you missed the mark? So I think it's worth asking these types of questions. I think it's good to be sort of really trying to understand who gets to be considered for these these types of accolades. Why them? And I don't really have a great answer for you. You know, I don't, but other than to say that these things are nuanced and that all of them come with their sort of pros and cons, and you know, saying peace, sometimes that means actually taking action that isn't always peaceful, but it could lead to that down the road. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
But I think there's a real difference between those laureates who've been more grassroots and those who've controlled state power. And most often those who've controlled state power have been controversial, and most recently the rescinding of Aung San Suu Kyi's Nobel Prize from a moment when she didn't have state power to one where she did is an interesting example of that. So we're coming to the end, and I guess what I wanted to ask you was, with all of this, this is a dark time. It's the age of Trump and, you know, Duterte and Modi and, you know, a lot of pretty frightening leaders, Netanyahu. How do you maintain hope, and how do you think constructive change happens? Small questions,
right.
to close on. So however you want to riff on those in closing is obviously
solve
fine.
all the world's problems. Yeah, I mean, even getting prepared today to come and talk, you know, I mean, I was watching the news related to Gaza, and you know, I mean, it's heavy. Like we are living in heavy times. And I actually wrote down the quote that's in the lobby of Rockefeller. That it's essential that we enable young people to see themselves as participants in one of the most exciting eras in history and to have a sense of purpose in relation to it. And he said that in 1930. So what that tells me is that that is true in every era, in every time. And what I'm seeing, when you think of 1930, that's the year after the big crash of 29, right? And what Rockefeller is saying is that it's, you know, it's young people who are going to take this on and who have to feel a connection to the work to right this country, to get it back onto stable ground. And that is what I'm seeing every day here in the United States and through my work with the 100 Million campaign. I'm seeing that activism. I'm seeing folks who are saying, not on our watch.
Parkland.
Yeah, exactly. Parkland is, I mean, that, you know, that to see it here in the United States, that it's young people who are finally pushing for some real change on an issue that I think a lot of adults had kind of given up on. I mean, I will admit that, you know, after Newtown, I thought, well, that's it. If you know, if the U.S. government, if Americans can watch elementary school children being gunned down and murdered and nothing changes, well, then that's it. Right. I mean, and to see that it's that Parkland, that it is high school students who are saying, nope, we're taking this on, and that it's actually starting to shake the trees, tells me that Rockefeller was onto something in 1930, and that it still rings true today to this moment. And that is where I really do find that hope. But it is about staying engaged. Part of the reason why we're, you know, in the position that we're in is so many people didn't vote in the 2016 election. And, you know, you mentioned I ran for office, I ran for state senate, and I did that in part because as a young woman of color, I felt really called to say, you know, I'm not running away. You will see me. I will be at your table. And we're going to fight for our country. And that I really believe is what I hope folks can hold on to when everything feels chaotic and a bit dark, is that we can do it, but we have to do it. You have to do the work. You have to stay engaged, and it is possible. And the three folks that I've worked for have proven that. All of them have had dark times, and all of them have continued to do the work.
Thank you, guys. Join me.
Thank you.